The motion is as follows. Mr. Ray, seconded by Mr. Eiking, moves that this House do now adjourn. Debate. The Honourable Member for Toronto Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank Mr. Speaker Scheer for giving us the opportunity to debate this issue today. I must confess, when I moved the motion, I wasn't sure whether the Speaker was going to agree with me on the urgency of the situation, but I'm very glad that he did. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that many Canadians might ask themselves, why would the House of Commons be taking an extra few hours of a Tuesday night to be debating a question that to many Canadians seems so far away. There are conflicts and there are challenges all over the world. And yet, this question of Syria has struck all of us as one that is extremely important. And let me try to express the reasons why. First of all, Mr. Speaker, because of where Syria is, a country of 22.5 million people in the middle of the Middle East, which has historically, over the last number of decades, been perhaps the most difficult and challenging part of the world in terms of resolving conflict and dealing with the potential possibilities of hostilities taking over and becoming even more serious than they already are. A country which has become the test for the United Nations' own sense of its role and its responsibilities to ensure that civilians are in fact protected and that there is human security for those people who are facing the challenge of how they're going to live and how they're going to survive and how they're going to get their next meal. A country which has been ruled by a brutal dictatorship, not for a few years, but for several decades, by the Assad family, father and now son, representing a small, relatively small religious sect within Islam, the Alawi sect, which has achieved a monopoly of the security service, which has armed itself significantly, which has dramatically repressed its population, which has effectively closed its economy, a country which, in the face of the changes that are underway throughout the region, has resisted every single one of these changes in terms of opening up the economy, recognizing the plural nature of its society, establishing good relations with its neighbors, and allowing a real sense of opportunity to its people. So it really has been no surprise, Mr. Speaker, that at a time when there has been this movement called the Arab Spring, though some people now feel that's perhaps an inappropriately optimistic term to describe it, nevertheless, it would come as no surprise that there would be strong elements within Syria that would insist that that country become more pluralistic, become more democratic, that it recognize human rights, and that it allow its people to have their say in who their government will be. Mr. Speaker, the Assad regime, when faced with this challenge from within, chose one particular path, the path of repression, a path which has caused enormous hardship to the people of Syria and which has caused great instability not only in Syria but also throughout the region. We now find, Mr. Speaker, that in a country of 22.5 million people, some 1.5 million of those people are now refugees living outside the country. That is in addition to the hundreds of thousands of people who are, as the saying goes, internally displaced. People who've been forced to leave their homes, who've been forced to move in somewhere else, leave whatever community they may happen to be in order to get to a safer place. Of those 1.4 million refugees, some 62,000 are in Egypt, 143,000 are in Iraq, 450,000 are in Jordan, 450,000 are in Lebanon, and over 320,000 are in Turkey. So, by any definition, whatever else we face in Syria, whatever else may be said about the instability, about what forces are at play, what is the overall security situation in the country, what is the challenge facing the security of the region itself posed by the violence and the repression in Syria, the one thing we know for certain is that this is a humanitarian crisis of the first proportion, that it is an issue which affects not only the conscience of the world and therefore of Canada, but it is an issue which has to be dealt with on a practical basis, because the presence of this many refugees in Jordan, the presence of this many refugees in Lebanon, this many refugees in Turkey, poses a security risk and a threat to those countries, to say nothing of the financial risk and the financial threat which they face as a result of having this many people suddenly descend on them. These are not wealthy countries when we look at the situation in Jordan. And I know that the Minister is going to be describing to us some of the things which the Government of Canada has been doing with respect to the refugee situation in Jordan, and I'm afraid on our side we're simply going to have to say not yet enough. There's still more to be done. There's more to be done in two ways, Mr. Speaker. The first is in assisting these countries to deal with the refugee crisis in their midst, to assist the UN High Commission on Refugees to deal with the continuing challenge which they face from having to run these camps, and finally, from dealing on a much more effective and efficient and advanced basis the claims of many of those refugees to be reconciled with their relatives in Canada. As opposed to many other situations where we have responded more effectively as a country, I think most recently of the crisis in Haiti, where we speeded up claims for immigration, we speeded up the ability of people to be reconciled with their families, we provided far more humanitarian aid. I would argue that in this situation, Canada has been relatively slow to respond, proportionately to other countries, certainly, and proportionately to the situation which we face and the seriousness of the situation which is faced in these countries. So, Mr. Speaker, let us first of all recognize the humanitarian nature of the crisis. The fact that, at the very least, Canada has to be more engaged with other countries in dealing with the seriousness of the challenge that is posed to Syria's neighbours by virtue of the size and the extent of the refugee crisis. My colleagues have spoken earlier. My colleague from Scarborough held a press conference last week where he described the urgent challenge facing a great many people in these communities, where it appears that the Canadian government has not been as responsive as it needs to be to the needs of people living in refugee camps, where we do not appear to have a program in place that allows for the speedy treatment and the speedy consideration of claims that are being made for reconciliation with families in Canada, and where we feel certainly, and the House would feel, that we need to be doing more to respond to the urgent nature of that humanitarian crisis. So, Mr. Speaker, let me just complete this point. There's more to be done on the humanitarian crisis. There's more to be done for refugees. There's more that Canada needs to do to step up to the plate and make a difference when it comes to dealing with the extent of the refugee crisis. If that was the only issue, Mr. Speaker, I think this could be a pretty simple debate. But the challenge that the world now faces in Syria is actually one of the most difficult and one of the most complex challenges that we face in many different places. The Assad regime, as I said before, we have to recognize its military strength. The Assad regime has the capacity to repress. It has repressed. It has not hesitated to bomb its own people. It has not hesitated to kill its own people. It has not hesitated to respond to every challenge to it by means of a military response. It has been brutal. And in that brutality, the United Nations estimates that as many as 80,000 people may have been killed. So, Mr. Speaker, if we were to apply a simple test and say, well, has the Assad regime treated its own people in a brutal fashion, and does that justify an effective response from the rest of the world? The answer would be yes. To which we can say the world has responded. It has responded by saying we have to cut Syria off from financial access to other markets. We have to make sure that the people who are leading the Syrian regime know how seriously the rest of the world treats what's going on in Syria, and there's been every effort made from a financial point of view to isolate Syria. But one has to say, as strong as those efforts may have been, and as coordinated as they have not had the effect, which all of us, I think, would like to be in a position to say needs to be done, to sufficiently weaken the Assad regime, to force it into a situation where it has to bargain with the rebels, it has to come to terms with the need for change, and it has to make every effort to find a political solution to the crisis that we face. That hasn't happened. So another simple response would be to say, well, why wouldn't the world simply conclude that if the Syrian regime is not prepared to treat its citizens properly, is not prepared to respond to the various resolutions of the Security Council, resolutions of the United Nations, resolutions of the Arab League, all of the statements that have been made for the government of Syria to come to grips with the reality, then you say, well, why wouldn't the world take further action, take military action? Naturally,
Mr. Speaker, there are always those who think that the military reaction is the necessary reaction when faced with a situation where the government is not responding. So not only in our opinion, but that's what the law is within the United Nations, and the decisions of the National Assembly and the Security Council. Countries have to be treated fairly. But we have to recognize what the problem is and the nature of the problem that exists in the Middle East. And it exists in Syria currently. That is to say that because of the nature of the conflict and the nature of where geographically Syria is located in the Middle East, there's no easy military solution. And I just listened to the minister on television a few moments ago, and he said that he prefers to see a political solution rather than a military solution. And I think that what the Minister of Foreign Affairs is saying is that it's hard for us to say that we don't agree. We would all prefer to have a political solution rather than a military one. But the problem that we have is that if people say there will be no military pressure put on Syria, if the world says there'll be no assistance to those who are rebelling against the government or in revolt against this dictatorial government in that country, well, the Syrian regime will say, okay, no problem. There's no pressure. We don't need to find a solution. And the civil war will continue. And that is why we are saying quite simply, Mr. Speaker, that it is a complex situation. But let us remember one thing, Mr. Speaker, which is that Syria is a country in a great deal of difficulty. There is a great deal of disagreement within the country. 80,000 people have died in that country because of this conflict, and people can't face the situation. We must find solutions. And that is where we are saying we have to have a full commitment of the Canadian government in the face of this situation.
And it's, I think, the strongest statement that I've certainly heard, that he's satisfied with the evidence that chemical weapons have been used in the struggle. The difficulty is finding out who's used them, when have they used them, and how have they used them. And again, I find myself in agreement with the minister. Of course that's what the world has to do, and of course it's proving very difficult to do it. But where, in fact, I think there's a need for us to be more engaged and not less engaged as a country is in recognizing the challenge that the instability in Syria creates for the entire region. The instability in Syria affects Lebanon. The instability in Syria affects Jordan. The instability in Syria affects Israel, which is why Israel has felt itself obliged to respond when faced with evidence that missiles are going from Iran to Syria to Hezbollah. And so we can't look at this situation in isolation. We can't say, well, you know, this all seems like a conflict so far away that we really can't get involved and can't be concerned. Because the reality, Mr. Speaker, is that not only is there a humanitarian crisis which demands a response from the rest of the world, there's also a crisis which will not stand still. And unless the world effectively engages with it, it threatens the stability of the entire region. And this is why, Mr. Speaker, we continue to hear from others in the region that they want to see a more coordinated response from the rest of the world. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not one of those people who thinks that Canada itself is going to come up with a magic solution, that somehow there's going to be some miraculous Canadian invention or intervention that's going to make a difference on its own. We're a middle power. But we are a middle power with many friends, and we are a middle power that is respected. And as a middle power, we have an obligation to use every means possible to effect two things. One is to ensure that the oppression and the killing for which the Assad regime is responsible comes to an end. Two, Canada should be part of the effort to use the International Criminal Court to hold those who are responsible for the conflict and who are responsible for death and mayhem in Syria, to hold them to account. If we do not do that, if we do not stand up for the rule of international law and for the role of the International Criminal Court, we're simply saying to the Assad regime, you can wash your hands of this conflict and nobody will ask any questions. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we have to recognize one other thing, and the Minister has referred to this in his comments. Not only the use of chemical weapons posing a threat to the very existence of some people and of some communities, and the tremendous instability which is created by the use of chemical weapons, completely against every order of international law, any test of humanity. It is, and this again is something that the Minister has referred to in his public comments, it is the extent to which Syria has become a playground for extremism, in which there are now, we know, there are fighters from Pakistan and fighters from Afghanistan and fighters from Chechnya and fighters who were in Iraq who are now back in Syria. And we have to understand this is the world in which we are now living. But the answer to that is not for Canada to be less engaged with the opposition. It's for us to be even more engaged with the opposition. Not, as the Minister might think I might say, not in arming the opposition, because that's never been a role that Canada has played. We've never played the role of an arms supplier to these various civil insurrections. Where what we have done is to say we are not afraid of politically engaging and understanding better who's who and who's where. And when we talk to people from the Syrian community in Canada, their main concern and main complaint, frankly, is that this government seems to be too determined to take a hands-off approach to even understanding the nature of the conflict and understanding the various elements in the opposition. I'm not pretending for a moment that it's easy, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not pretending for a moment that it lends itself to easy solutions. I don't believe that a one-sided military intervention at the moment from the United States or from some other coalition is likely to get us to where we need to be because of the very forces of instability that are now at play. I strongly support what Secretary Kerry and President Putin have decided to do, which is to hold another conference to get countries together to try to find a political solution. But I do think we have to recognize that unless the world stands prepared to take the necessary steps to create the stability we want to see, the world needs to see in Syria, the risk is even greater instability in the years ahead and even greater hardship for the people who are living there. A humanitarian crisis, Mr. Speaker, a political crisis, a security crisis, an issue that demands a response from Canada. We would all like to see a future of stability, where the drive from Jerusalem to Damascus could happen without nary a checkpoint, where the drive from Damascus to Beirut could happen with nary a checkpoint, and where you could take a train ride from Tel Aviv to Beirut without nary a checkpoint. We'd like to see that kind of a world, an open world, a free world, a democratic world. We're not going to get there overnight. We're not going to get there by wishing for it or by praying for it. And we're not going to get there by simply analyzing what's happening from a great distance. We have to be prepared to become more engaged, Mr. Speaker, And in that very engagement, I think Canada will gain some of the respect and some of the position in the world that we think Canada deserves for the efforts that it can make and should make in the months ahead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.